My name is Fazar Warren, I'm 36 years old, and the day my father told me my 7-year-old son Noah would get nothing from my grandmother's inheritance, I knew something was seriously wrong. No DNA, no inheritance, Dad said, sliding a legal folder across his dining table. I looked at him and smiled. Fine, Dad, let's do it. He expected me to panic, but I didn't. What he didn't expect was what I said next. And if we're testing Noah, we're testing you too. His smile vanished. My grandmother had left behind a lake house in Michigan, several rental properties, and nearly $1.8 million in investments. Dad had already started dividing everything between my two brothers, acting like Noah didn't exist. But then he crossed a line I never saw coming. 2 days later, my lawyer called and told me Dad had secretly frozen Noah's college account through the estate attorney. Every dollar Grandma had specifically saved for her great-grandson was locked until the DNA dispute was settled. When I confronted him, he shrugged. If he's not family, why should he get family money? I stared at him, thinking, seriously? This was his grandson. Then he leaned closer and said, "You should be careful, Fazar. Fighting me could cost you everything too." That sounded less like a warning and more like a threat, but there was something else bothering me. 3 months before Grandma died, she had grabbed my wrist during one of my visits and whispered, "There's something blue in this house your father must never find." I had laughed at the time, thinking she meant an old jewelry box. Now, sitting across from Dad, I suddenly remembered those words exactly. There was a blue box somewhere in Grandma's house, and judging by the fear that flashed across my father's face when I mentioned it, I realized one terrifying thing. He knew exactly what she meant, and whatever was inside that box was the real reason he wanted Noah's DNA. By Monday morning, Dad had turned the DNA test into a legal war. His attorney sent me a formal notice saying Noah's inheritance would remain frozen until the laboratory confirmed his biological connection to Grandma's family. But that wasn't enough. Dad also demanded that I stop accessing Grandma's lake house until the dispute was resolved. I called him and said, "You gotta be kidding me. Dad, you're trying to lock my son out of a house Grandma specifically left him," he answered coldly. "I'm protecting the family." I almost laughed. From a 7-year-old? He hung up that afternoon. I found Noah sitting on the front steps with his backpack beside him. He looked up and asked, "Mom, why doesn't Grandpa want me anymore?" My chest tightened. I pulled him into my arms and told him none of this was his fault. But that night, I discovered Dad had gone even further. He had contacted the school and tried to remove Noah from a private scholarship Grandma had funded. That was the moment my anger turned into something colder. He wasn't protecting an inheritance anymore. He was trying to make Noah feel like an outsider. Before the DNA test even happened, I called the estate lawyer and demanded every document Dad had submitted. She warned me that if I challenged him publicly, the entire estate could become tied up in court for years. Then she quietly added, "There's one thing you should know. Your grandmother left a sealed personal file that your father was specifically forbidden from opening." I froze. "Where is it?" She said it was stored at the lake house. I drove there before sunset. Grandma's house felt different without her. Every room still smelled faintly like cedar and cinnamon. I searched the office, the bedroom, even the old pantry. Nothing. Then I remembered her strange warning, something blue. I opened a cabinet beneath the stairs and found an old blue metal box buried behind Christmas decorations. My hands started shaking. There was no lock on it. Inside were photographs, medical records, and one sealed envelope with my father's name written across it. But before I could open it, my phone rang. It was Dad. "Fazar," he said, his voice suddenly calm. "Put that box back exactly where you found it." I stared at the envelope. "How do you know I found it?" Silence. Then he whispered, "Because your grandmother promised me you'd never see what's inside." And just like that, the DNA test stopped being my biggest concern. The next morning, I took the blue box straight to my attorney, but I kept the sealed envelope untouched. My father had already shown me he was willing to play dirty, and I wasn't about to give him another advantage. We scheduled the DNA test for Friday at an independent laboratory in Chicago, with supervised samples from Noah, me, and Dad. When Dad heard his own sample would be included, he exploded. "That has nothing to do with this," he snapped. I looked him straight in the eyes. "Then you should have nothing to worry about." He said nothing. After that, Friday came, and the samples were collected under strict supervision. Noah thought the cheek swab was funny, but Dad barely spoke. He kept staring at the sealed evidence bags like they contained a sentence he already knew. 2 weeks later, the laboratory called me. The woman on the phone sounded careful. "Ms. Warren, your son's results are clear. Noah is your biological son, and there is no question about his relationship to your maternal family." Relief washed over me, but then she paused. "However, your father's sample produced an unexpected result." My stomach dropped. "What does that mean?" She said the full report had to go through the attorneys, But one comparison had already been confirmed: Dad was not biologically related to the man listed as his father. I sat completely still. Suddenly Grandma's warning made sense. The blood test wasn't exposing Noah, it was exposing Dad. That evening, I opened the sealed envelope from the blue box. Inside was an old hospital record dated 1989, along with a handwritten note from Grandma. Daniel was never told the whole truth. My father's name was Daniel Warren. I kept reading. The document showed that Grandma had once discovered records suggesting Dad had been adopted shortly after birth, but there was another page missing. Before I could understand what it meant, Dad arrived at my house. He looked exhausted. "You opened it?" he said. I nodded. "You knew?" He sat down and stared at the floor. Then he whispered, "I knew there was a secret, but I never knew how deep it went." I thought that was the confession. It wasn't. Dad looked up at me and said, "Fazar, your grandmother didn't hide that box to protect herself. She hid it because the truth inside could change who legally owns the lake house." My heart started pounding. The DNA test had already proven Noah belonged, but now I realized the inheritance fight had never really been about my son. It was about a secret my father had spent his entire life protecting. I looked at my father and said, "Then tell me everything." For several seconds, Daniel said nothing. Finally, he opened the blue box and pulled out a second envelope I hadn't seen before. Inside was a birth certificate from 1989. But the name on it wasn't Daniel Warren. It belonged to another baby boy born in Chicago that same week. My father's hands started shaking. "Grandma found out when I was 20, he said. "The man I believed was my father wasn't my biological father." I stared at him. "Then who was?" He slid one photograph across the table. It showed Grandma standing beside a younger man I had never seen before. On the back, she had written his name in one sentence. "He owned the lake house before your grandfather took it." My jaw dropped. Dad explained that the man had been his biological father, and before he died, he had placed the lake house and a private investment account into a trust for his future descendants. But my grandfather had hidden the documents and convinced Grandma to stay silent because he feared losing everything. Dad eventually discovered the truth, but instead of exposing it, he kept the secret because he believed the property belonged to the family name. I looked at him and finally understood why he had fought so hard against Noah. He wasn't trying to prove my son wasn't family. He was terrified that the DNA test would force the entire inheritance history into court. "You used my son as a shield," I said. Dad looked down. I was scared. "You froze his college money. You threatened me. You tried to take his inheritance and you were scared." He had no answer. I could have destroyed him with everything I had learned, but then I thought about Noah and the question he had asked me days earlier: "Why doesn't Grandpa want me anymore?" I didn't want my son growing up believing family meant revenge, so I gave Dad one choice. He would withdraw every challenge against Noah, release the college fund immediately, and sign over the lake house according to Grandma's original trust. He also had to give up control of the estate and disclose the hidden documents to the attorney. If he refused, I would take everything to court. Dad signed. 2 weeks later, Noah and I stood on the lake house porch while the evening sun reflected across the water. He looked at me and smiled. "So this is really ours?" I hugged him. "It always was, buddy." Then I opened Grandma's final note from the blue box. It said, "Fazar, never let fear make you question the people who love you." I looked at Noah running toward the water and finally understood why Grandma had hidden the truth for so long. She wasn't protecting the inheritance. She was waiting for someone strong enough to use the truth without becoming cruel, and that person, somehow, had become me.